Hey horror lovers, I'm letting you decide my next story. Drop your spookiest, wildest, or most disturbing ideas in the comments, and the top comment will be the one I bring to life. Don't forget to like and subscribe, it helps me know you enjoy my content and want more. Now let's dive right in. If you'd told me a week ago I'd be delivering mail in the mountains, I would have laughed. Not because it's a bad job, but because it wasn't my job. I was just filling in. Mr. Albright, our usual mailman, had taken a bad fall, some accident on one of the back roads. I'd heard bits and pieces, but no one in town seemed to have the full story. A few people exchanged nervous glances when I asked, brushing it off with, "Mountain roads are tricky," or "Albright's been out there too long." It didn't matter. The mail still had to go out. The volunteer association was the kind of group that helped out wherever needed, and since no one else was willing to take on the route, I stepped up. I figured it'd be simple. Drive, drop letters, repeat. Turns out, it wasn't that easy. Before I could even start, I was told to visit Mr. Albright at the hospital. "He wants to see you first," one of the older volunteers said, voice low. I didn't question it. Maybe he just wanted to make sure I wouldn't crash the mail van. I found him in room 302, wrapped in a blanket, his left arm heavily bandaged. He looked up when I walked in, his weathered face breaking into a crooked smile. "Well, I'll be damned. Little Meredith Sullivan. Haven't seen you since you were yay high." I smiled, taking a seat beside his bed. I did remember him. He'd been the mailman since forever. Growing up, I'd see him driving around in his old postal van, whistling to himself. "Heard you're taking over for me." "For a little while," I nodded, "until you're back on your feet." Albright let out a small chuckle, but there was something off about it. "You think this is just a quick favor, don't ya?" Before I could answer, he pulled something from under his pillow, a set of keys attached to a faded leather tag. He held them out, but before I could take them, he gripped my wrist. His fingers were cold. "Before I hand these over, you need to listen to me, kid. The folks in town, they're fine, but the ones living outside of it," he exhaled sharply, "they're different." I frowned. "Different how?" "They've been out there too long." He looked past me, out the window, eyes distant. "Most of them used to be just like us, but they changed. You'll see what I mean." That uneasy feeling grew. I wrote down some names, he continued, patting his nightstand. "People you gotta be real careful with." He slid me a worn notebook page, creased at the edges. 5 names. Next to each, a set of rules. "They're still people, Meredith, but they ain't all there anymore. If you follow the rules, you'll be fine." I stared at the page. "And if I don't?" Albright's grip on my wrist tightened. "Then you let me know right away." There was a weight in his words, something I didn't understand yet. I forced a smile. All right, I'll follow the rules." Albright studied me for a long moment before slowly letting go. He placed the keys in my palm. "Good girl." I laughed. "You make it sound like I'm going to war." He didn't laugh back. I left the hospital with the keys in my pocket, list tucked away in my bag, shaking off the weird feeling. Maybe Albright was just paranoid. Maybe being a mailman for so many years out there in the deep woods had gotten to him. I told myself it was just mail. Just people. Then I met Mrs. Connolly. Her house was perched on a hill, surrounded by dozens of clocks, hanging from her porch, strung up like wind chimes, nailed to trees. Some worked, others were frozen in time. She was already on her rocking chair when I pulled up, humming to herself. As I stepped out of the van, she turned her head sharply toward me, smiling. "Oh, my dear, what time is it?" Albright's words rang in my head. "Lie." "Oh, around noon," I said casually, though my hands felt clammy. Her smile never faltered. "Noon, how lovely." Crack. One of the clocks nailed to a nearby tree suddenly fell, shattering right next to my feet. I jumped back, heart hammering. Mrs. Connolly just rocked in her chair, as if she hadn't noticed. "Thank you, dear. Have a wonderful day." I hurried back to the van. The next stop was just a mile down the road, a small quiet house. 2 kids already standing on the porch, waiting. They were identical, same light brown hair, same old-fashioned clothes. There was something off about them. Not in a monstrous way, but in a too still, too perfect way. "Do we look older today?" Their voices were synchronized, and my stomach twisted. Déjà vu. I felt like I'd seen them before, but I couldn't remember where. "Maybe a little," I forced a smile. The twins giggled, repeating my words in perfect sync. Then, without another word, they turned and walked inside. As the door shut, I felt a cold chill. I climbed back into the van, gripping the wheel too tightly. I told myself it was just small-town weirdness, that people in isolated places had their own ways of living. But as I pulled back onto the road, something moved in the trees. A shape. Tall, too thin. I turned my head fully this time. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. You're just imagining things. I pressed the gas pedal and kept driving. I didn't check my mirrors. I told myself I was overthinking everything. The clocks, the two perfect twins, the weird creeping sensation that I was being watched. Small towns had strange people. That was all. Still, as I drove further down the winding roads, something gnawed at the back of my mind. It wasn't just the people. It was the routine. I started noticing it by accident. At one house, the mailbox was already stuffed, letters yellowing from days, maybe weeks of being ignored. But I'd delivered to this house yesterday. The mail should have been fresh. Another house, same thing. Stacked envelopes, untouched. Some people's mailboxes were empty every day, as if they never got mail at all. Others had mail on the same exact days, without fail. It was like a system, something unspoken and precise. No one in town had mentioned it. Albright hadn't mentioned it. I thought about the list of names he gave me crumpled in my pocket. Had I already missed something? The next house on my route was different. I felt it before I even pulled up, an unease in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The porch was lined with glass jars, rows and rows of them, each filled with small, pale shapes. I stepped out of the van, swallowing hard. Teeth. Hundreds of human teeth. Some yellowed with age, others fresh, glistening white. A cold shudder ran down my spine. I grabbed the package marked Thurman O, double-checking the rule Albright had given me. Leave the package on the third step. Knock exactly 3 times. Walk away before he opens the door. That last part bothered me. I moved quickly, setting the box down on the exact third step, my heartbeat too loud in my ears. Then I knocked. 1, 2, 3. I turned and walked back to the van, forcing myself not to look back. The van door slammed shut, my fingers trembling against the keys. I shifted into drive, ready to get the hell away. And then I saw him, in the side mirror. He stood in the doorway, staring straight at me, not moving, not blinking. His mouth was slightly open, as if he was whispering something just below the sound of the engine. My hands clenched the wheel, knuckles white. I looked away from the mirror and straight ahead. I drove. I didn't check the mirror again. The road back to town was quiet, just the steady hum of the tires against cracked pavement. I let out a slow breath, forcing my nerves to settle. I was fine. This job was fine. Then I saw it. Between the trees, just past the bend in the road, a figure. Tall. Unnaturally tall, its limbs too long and too thin. It wasn't moving, it just stood there, deep in the woods, watching. A jolt of panic ran through me. I blinked, and it was gone. My breath hitched, fingers tightening around the wheel. A trick of the light. It had to be. Just a shadow. I pressed down on the gas pedal, eyes locked on the road ahead. I didn't look back. I told myself I was imagining things, but the feeling in my chest, the growing, pulling dread, told me otherwise. Something wasn't right. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Even as I pulled into the post office's lot that evening, parked the mail van, and locked up for the night, the sensation clung to my skin like static. The next morning, I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself for days. It's just in your head. But as I flipped through the stack of letters I needed to deliver that day, my eyes landed on something that shouldn't have been there. An envelope. Plain white, no stamp, no return address. The recipient's name was printed in neat block letters. Resident, 124, Greystone Lane. I frowned, turning the envelope over in my hands. I had never heard of Greystone Lane. Curious, I pulled out my phone and typed the address into the GPS. No results. I double-checked the spelling, tried again. Still nothing. A chill crawled up my back. Greystone Lane didn't exist. I wasn't about to waste time driving in circles looking for a street that wasn't real, so I decided to ask someone. At the small coffee shop near the post office, I ran into Jenna, one of the other volunteers. She was a few years older than me and had lived in town her whole life. If anyone would know, it was her. "Hey Jenna," I said, setting the envelope on the counter. "Do you know where Greystone Lane is?" She was stirring sugar into her coffee, but the second I said the name, her hand froze mid-stir. She didn't look up. "Where'd you hear that?" she asked, voice lower than before. I gestured to the envelope. "Got a letter addressed there. Figured I'd ask before wasting gas looking for a road that might not be real." Jenna didn't say anything. She just pushed her coffee away, grabbed her bag, and left. No explanation. No comment. Nothing. I decided to ask one more person. Mr. Albright was still recovering, but he was the only one I trusted to give me a straight answer. When I got to the hospital, he was sitting up in bed, flipping through an old paperback novel. The second he saw me, he smiled. "Meredith, how's the route treating you?" "Weirdly." I sat down beside his bed and handed him the envelope. "This showed up today, 124 Greystone Lane, but that place doesn't exist, does it?" The smile on his face faded. "You didn't go there, right?" I hesitated. "No, I mean, how could I? It doesn't exist." He let out a slow breath and relaxed a little. "Good, keep it that way." "What does that mean?" "It means you don't want to know what happens when a mailman delivers to that address." I waited for him to say more. He didn't. Instead, he took the envelope from my hands and tucked it under his pillow. "I'll take care of this one." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I left the hospital with more questions than answers. The rest of the route was uneventful, at least until I reached the next name on Albright's list. Hartley C. His house was one of the furthest out, a small one-story place with no chairs on the porch, no decorations, nothing personal at all. Just a single red mailbox, standing alone at the end of his gravel driveway. I double-checked the rules, placed the mail in the red box, turn away before he approaches. I got out, walked up to the mailbox, and slid in the letters. Then I turned around. Footsteps shuffled behind me. Not normal footsteps. The sound was off, like someone dragging their heels unnaturally against the gravel. I didn't look back. I walked straight to the van, opened the door, and slid inside, gripping the steering wheel. I wasn't sure why, but every instinct told me not to look. I put the van into drive and pulled away without glancing at my mirrors. Not until I reached the end of his road. Then, just for a second, I risked a look. He was still outside, walking backward toward his door, every step slow, deliberate. His head was turned toward me. His face was blank, expressionless, but I could feel him watching. I pressed the gas and sped away. By the time I was heading back toward town, my hands were shaking on the wheel. I was gripping the steering wheel too tight, jaw clenched. I tried to focus on the road, but that uneasy feeling was still gnawing at me. Then I saw it. Movement in the tree line. I caught it in my peripheral vision, a tall, distorted shadow weaving through the trees, matching my speed. My breath hitched. I pressed my foot harder against the gas pedal, my stomach twisting in a way that told me it was following me. I turned my head, forcing myself to look directly at it. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't look at the forest again. And I didn't check my mirrors either. Not this time. I didn't drive straight home after my shift. I should have. I should have shut off my brain, ignored the growing pit of dread, and just gone to sleep like a normal person. But I couldn't. Because this wasn't normal. The untouched mail, the unspoken schedule, the twins that hadn't aged, the man who moved in reverse, and now the non-existent house. I parked outside the local museum, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the entrance like it might give me answers before I even walked inside. It didn't. I let out a breath and forced myself to move. The museum was small, just a converted courthouse filled with relics from the town's history. A few glass cases displayed old farming equipment, dusty black and white photographs, and newspaper clippings about the first settlers. No one was at the front desk. I didn't need permission anyway. I made my way toward the archives, a back room filled with metal filing cabinets and photo albums stacked haphazardly on a wooden table. The air smelled like aged paper and something slightly damp. I had no idea what I was looking for, only that I needed to start somewhere. I flipped open the first album, scanning through class photos from decades ago. The first few pages were boring, just regular kids in button-up shirts posing stiffly for the camera. Then I turned the page and froze. The Mulligan twins, same faces, same hair, same eerie, wide-eyed stares, but the date beneath the photo read 1956. I stared at the photo, pulse hammering in my ears. They hadn't changed, not a single wrinkle, not a single sign of aging. It wasn't just weird, it was impossible. My fingers trembled as I turned the page, flipping through more class photos, more town gatherings, more faces that shouldn't have been there. Old Man Thurman, Miss Holloway, Mr. Hartley, all of them untouched by time. I flipped faster, searching for an explanation, searching for something that would make this make sense. Then I found the missing persons reports. Dozens of them. All people from the outskirts. Some reports were recent, but others dated back decades. Their photos yellowed with age, their faces eerily similar to the ones I'd seen just yesterday. My stomach twisted. They weren't just isolated. They weren't just weird. They were stuck. I slammed the album shut, grabbing it off the table. I wasn't going to figure this out by myself. I needed to ask someone. As I stepped out into the main hall, I saw an older man shelving books near the entrance. He'd worked here as long as I could remember, a retired teacher, the kind of guy who always had an answer for everything. "Excuse me," I called, approaching him. I was looking through some of the old class photos, and Before I could finish, his entire demeanor changed. His face darkened. His fingers tightened around the book in his hands. "Don't." I blinked. "Don't what?" "Don't ask about them." A sharp chill crawled down my spine. "You know something. I know that if you keep looking, you won't like what you find." My grip on the album tightened. "What happened to them?" "You need to stop asking questions, Meredith." His voice was low, urgent, but what unsettled me most was his expression. Not anger, not defensiveness. Fear. I left the museum feeling like I had even more pieces of a puzzle, but no way to put them together. The sun was already dipping below the trees, stretching long shadows across the parking lot as I made my way back to the van. I had the key halfway to the lock when I saw something. Not in front of me. In the van's window. A reflection. Tall, skeletal, twisted. Its body stretched wrong, too many joints bending at unnatural angles. It was standing right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the empty street. Just the quiet, whispering wind. I backed up fast, fumbling with the keys, heart hammering in my chest. I locked the doors as soon as I was inside. Gripping the wheel, I took a deep, shaking breath. Then I put the van in drive and got the hell out of there. I barely remembered the drive to the hospital. One moment, I was gripping the wheel, heart pounding from what I'd seen in the van's reflection. The next, I was pushing through the hospital doors, my pulse hammering in my ears. I needed answers. Not speculation. Not cryptic warnings. The truth. Mr. Albright was sitting upright in bed when I burst into his hospital room. His eyes flicked up from whatever book he was reading, and when he saw my face, his expression hardened. "You saw it, didn't you?" I froze. His voice wasn't surprised. It was resigned. Like he'd been waiting for this. I slammed the old photo album onto the small hospital table beside him, the one from the museum. It fell open to the class photo from 1956. "Explain this." Albright didn't look down. He didn't need to. His fingers curled over the edge of his blanket, his shoulders tensing. "Meredith?" "No more bullshit," I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Tell me what's going on. Tell me why those people out there haven't aged, why their names keep showing up in missing persons reports." I shoved the album toward him. "Tell me why I saw something in the trees." That one got a reaction. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he reached over and shut the book, his fingers trembling slightly against the worn cover. Then he finally looked at me. "Sit down." "I wasn't in an accident," he said after a long pause. "That's not why I got pulled from the route." I sat, arms crossed tight over my chest, waiting. I was attacked. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. By what? Albright exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Not what? Who?" I blinked. "It's not something out there in the woods, Meredith. It used to be people. The ones who stayed in the outskirts too long. The ones it got to first." My stomach twisted. "You're saying—" "They don't just go missing," he interrupted, his voice low, heavy. "They change. It feeds off them, slowly, and by the time anyone notices—" He trailed off. I didn't need him to finish. The answer was already sitting like ice in my gut. "It replaces them." Albright gave a slow, grim nod. "They look like themselves, sound like themselves. But it's not them anymore." I thought of Old Man Thurman, his glass jars full of teeth. I thought of Mrs. Connolly and her endless broken clocks. I thought of Hartley, moving in reverse. I had delivered mail to them. Had spoken to them. And they weren't people anymore. I thought I could stop it. Albright flexed his injured hand, staring at the bandages. I was wrong. What happened? He didn't speak right away. Then, I saw someone out there I wasn't supposed to see. He didn't say who. Didn't say what he saw that gave it away. Next thing I knew, I was lying on my back in the woods, my shoulder torn to hell, the van door wide open. Why didn't it finish you off? He chuckled dryly, shaking his head. Guess I wasn't worth keeping. A shiver crawled up my spine. So what am I supposed to do? I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Quit? Walk away? Albright's expression darkened. It doesn't matter what you do now. You've seen it. His fingers tightened around the blanket. And once it knows you can see it, Meredith. His eyes flicked to the hospital door, like he was afraid something was listening. It doesn't let go. I left the hospital feeling like my head had been split open, stuffed with something I wasn't meant to know. Albright's words clung to me, heavier than the cold mountain air. They don't just go missing, they change. Once it knows you can see it, Meredith, it doesn't let go. I wanted to pretend he was wrong, that this was all just small-town paranoia mixed with too many late shifts in my overactive imagination. But I knew better now. I'd already seen it. Not fully, not up close. But I was about to. The roads were quiet that evening. Too quiet. Usually I could hear the distant hum of the radio, the crackle of gravel beneath my tires, the occasional wind rushing through the trees. But now, nothing. Not even the usual distant rustling of birds. I swallowed, gripping the wheel. The town was only about 15 minutes away. I just had to get back, get inside, and figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I pressed my foot a little harder on the gas. Then, my breath caught in my throat. Something was standing in the road. A figure. Tall. Unnaturally tall. Its limbs were too long, stretched past what human bones should allow. The arms hung almost to its knees, its fingers too sharp, too thin. It stood completely still, head slightly tilted as if it were listening for something. For me. I slammed the brakes. The van jerked forward, skidding to a rough stop, tires screeching against the pavement. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs as I sat there, staring at it, unable to move. The headlights illuminated its form, but something was wrong. The shadows didn't fall right on its body. It was like the light just bent around it, refusing to settle. A shape that shouldn't exist. I sucked in a shaky breath, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. It didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I forced my hand toward the gear shift, moving slower than I should have, every part of me screaming not to look away from it. I shifted into reverse, pressed the gas. The van didn't move. The engine let out a strained whine, sputtering like it was struggling against something I couldn't see. No. I twisted the key. Nothing. Tried again. Nothing. The thing took a step forward. The motion was unnatural, as if it had never moved before and was only just now figuring out how. Its joints didn't bend correctly. Its feet barely touched the ground. Another step. I slammed my hand against the dashboard, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. It was coming closer. I twisted the key again. Come on. Still nothing. It was only a few feet away now. My vision blurred at the edges, fear clawing at the back of my skull. Move. It was almost at the hood of the van. Its hands twitched. Then, everything went black. For a second, maybe two, there was nothing. No sound, no light, just an empty, endless void swallowing me whole. Then, just as suddenly, I blinked. The road was empty. My hands were still clenched on the wheel, my foot still hovering over the gas pedal. I gasped in a breath like I'd just been pulled from deep underwater. The engine roared to life. I didn't question it, didn't look around, didn't check the mirrors. I just hit the gas and drove. By the time I reached the edge of town, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely steer. I parked in front of my apartment, turned off the van, and sat there for a long moment, staring at my reflection in the window. My face was pale. My eyes looked wrong, too wide, too hollow, like something had taken something from me. I slowly turned my head to look at the empty passenger seat. There was nothing there. But for some reason, I still felt like I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I shut off the lights, locked my door, pulled the blankets up to my chin like that would somehow keep it out. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. Tall, impossible, watching me from the road. And then the darkness, that black, empty space where I had stopped existing. I stared at the ceiling until morning, my mind replaying Albright's words like a skipping record. Once it knows you can see it, Meredith, it doesn't let go. I was marked, but I wasn't the only one. I found Albright exactly where I'd left him, still sitting in that damn hospital bed, his face drawn and tired like he already knew what I was gonna say. "We have to get them out," I told him, gripping the edge of his bedside table. "The ones that are still normal, the ones who haven't changed yet." He let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "I figured you'd say that. So you'll help me?" He gave a tired nod. "I'll help you, kid, but I don't think it's gonna make a difference." "Why not?" "Because it won't let us." We took the mail van. It was the only vehicle big enough to fit multiple people if we needed to, though neither of us had any real plan for how we were going to convince them to come with us. The first few stops were uneventful. Empty houses, lights off, no movement inside. Then we reached the outskirts, and I felt it, like a weight pressing into my chest, like the air was too thick, too still. Albright was gripping the dashboard, his gaze flicking to the trees, watching for something. "You feel that?" he muttered. I nodded, my hands tightening around the wheel. Then the road changed. I should have noticed it earlier. The same mailbox, the same street sign, the same set of trees. We had driven past this point already. I swallowed hard. "Albright?" "Yeah. I see it." I pressed down harder on the gas, my fingers shaking. We had driven straight. We hadn't turned. And yet, we were looping. The town was safe. That was what Albright had told me. But this part, the route, it didn't want to let us leave. We reached the final stop on my list. A small, isolated house on the edge of the woods. I recognized it. I had delivered mail here before. And that was when I saw them. A figure standing outside the house. Not moving. Not blinking. Just standing there. Their skin was too pale. Their limbs too stiff, like they were still learning how to use them. Their eyes, black. I slammed the brakes, my stomach turning. Albright's breath hitched beside me. Shit! I didn't hear the door open, but suddenly, it was there. The entity, standing behind them. Its too thin frame loomed over the possessed figure, its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. Then in perfect, unbroken unison, they tilted their heads too. I felt my pulse crash against my ribs. Albright grabbed my wrist. "We need to split up." "What?" "You go around back. I'll get inside. If anyone's left in that house, we're getting them out." I hesitated. Everything in me was screaming not to move, not to turn my back on it. "Meredith," I forced a nod. Then I stepped out of the van. The air was thick, buzzing, like something was wrong with reality itself. I stepped toward the back of the house, my boots crunching on dead grass. My breath felt too loud in my ears. My heart beat even louder. I could hear Albright moving inside, shuffling, speaking. His voice urgent, tense, then silence. I turned toward the front of the house. The door was wide open, the van was still running, but Albright was gone. I froze. I knew what this meant. I knew what was happening. I ran forward, my breath catching in my throat. Albright, nothing. The house was empty. The thing that had been standing outside, gone. And the road ahead of me? It was gone too. Nothing but trees, no road, no way forward, only the route behind me. Only the way back. Only the sound of something moving in the trees. I didn't run. I should have. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to move. But I didn't. Because the moment I turned to flee, I knew it would catch me. The thing in the trees was waiting, watching, just like before. I took a slow, shaking breath. Then I stepped forward. Not toward the woods, not toward the thing. Toward the mail van. Albright was gone. The house was empty. The road behind me was the only path left. I climbed into the driver's seat, my fingers trembling as I grabbed the wheel. The engine was still running. It had been waiting for me. Like it knew. Like it wanted me to leave. I pressed my foot to the gas, and I drove. I made it back to town. I don't remember how. One moment I was on the looping roads, trapped in the same dead space over and over. The next, I was passing the welcome sign, the streetlights flickering as I entered town limits. No one noticed me, or maybe they just pretended not to. I drove to the post office, parked the van in its usual spot, and sat there for what felt like hours. Waiting. For what, I don't know. For Albright to walk through the door? For someone to tell me this was all in my head? For something to happen? Nothing did. I stepped out of the van. The streets were quiet. The town felt different, like something was off balance. I reached for the office door handle, and then I saw them. The posters. They were taped to streetlights, pinned to the bulletin board outside the post office, flapping in the cold breeze like dead leaves. Missing person. I took a step forward, my stomach twisting. The faces on the first few were familiar. People from the outskirts. Names I had delivered to. Thurman. Hartley. Connolly. Their smiling photographs stared back at me, hollow and frozen in time. I already knew what I was about to see next. I forced my eyes downward, to the newest flyer at the bottom of the stack. Meredith Sullivan. Missing. The air left my lungs. My own face looked back at me. The same photo from my volunteer ID. The same person I had been just days ago. But I wasn't missing. I was right here. I took a step back. My head spun. My heart slammed against my ribs. I looked around, desperate for anyone to see me. I opened my mouth to call out, "Guess the mail route needs another replacement." A voice, low, tired. A local I didn't recognize stood a few feet away, staring at the flyer. I turned to face him, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes skipped right over me, like I wasn't there, like I had already disappeared.